Right. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It is lovely to see you this Thursday. I am actually not at my usual desk in New Haven. I'm in a cabin outside of Acadia National Park, which is a fun place to do this. And I am very happy to introduce Daf Yomi Week in Review. I'm sorry, my name is Rachel Sharnerman. I edit My Jewish Learning, and we are learning this morning with Rabbi Elliot Goldberg. So Rabbi Goldberg, go ahead.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm back to my regular desk in South Orange, New Jersey after a summer at Camp Vermont, New England. So I guess we've traded places from homes to cabins. Rachel. Okay. Good morning or afternoon, whatever part of the day it is for you. I just put a link to the slides in the chat. You are welcome to follow along on the screen or open those up as well if you would like. We're gonna look at a segment today from early in this week from Masechet Avodah Zarah. But first, I want to give you a little overview of the structure of what we're going to look at today, because I want to look at the content and talk about the content of a particular passage and what it says to us about the themes of Masechet Avodah Zarah, but I want us to be attuned to the different layers in the Gemara. One of the things that I find with Daf Yomi, with the pace at which we have to read, we tend to flatten the Gemara out, meaning we read a Mishnah and we read the long discussion in the Gemara, and you're moving at such a pace that it's harder to pause and take note of what's an earlier piece of Gemara, what's a later piece of Gemara. And I think sometimes because of that pace, we lose some of the nuances of the text to see the multi-generational conversation that's going on and how different layers of the Gemara change the conversation or change the meaning of the conversation. So today we're going to look at both the content of one discussion of one sugya in the Gemara, but also we're going to pay attention to the layers and see how that affects what we might take away from that. So that's a little introduction. I'm sharing my screen right now. And I'm going to start the slideshow. All right. I am sharing my screen, says Zoom. Let me just move all the Zoom windows away from the slides. So the passage that we're going to look at today has three main sections. One is a maaseh, a narrative. Maaseh sometimes means like, a happening. Maaseh shehaya, sometimes the Hebrew would be, right? A thing that once happened, or maaseh shehaya sometimes is like once upon a time. These are tales of the rabbis and something that occurred. I would put them in the genre of folklore as opposed to history, right? The Gemara isn't like a newspaper reporting current events or even like a history textbook reporting historical events, but it tells tales of the lives of the rabbis. It's feasible that these tales were actual incidents that became part of the Talmudic dialogue. It's also possible that it just became stories that were told that became stories over the generations, found their way into the text. And the distance from the actual event, if there was one, to the telling in the Talmud might have changed many of the details, like stories, especially oral narrative, tend to change over time. But we're left with the stories that are part of the discussion. Then we're going to look at an early layer of the Gemara's conversation about the story and a later layer. And we're going to try to contrast the early and the later layer to see how they're treating this material a little differently. So that's a quick graphic and overview about what's coming. Now let's move forward. So we're starting from Masechet Avodah Zarah back to 50. We're going to be looking at 58a and b. Uh-oh. Wait, I'm missing a whole slide. Hang on just a second. I'm going to unshare my screen. Uh-oh. Pardon me. Give me technical difficulties for a second. I'm sorry. I seem to be I've lost track of a slide. Oh, there we go. I have fixed the problem. And I'm going to share my screen once again. Sorry about that. Here we go. I found the missing slide. There we go. Rabbi Yochanan ben Arzah and Rabbi Yossi ben Horai were sitting and drinking wine. This fits into one of the conversations on Masechet Avodah Zarah.
Could you share the screen again?
Oh, sorry. Thought I did. that's too the first, well, both on me. I'm gonna share screen again. Yes. Thank you, Rachel. Good.
That's why they pay me the big bucks.
All right, that's good. That's why we're all here together. All right. I got the slide and I've shared my screen. We are set to go. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Arzah and Rabbi Yossi ben Horai were sitting together and drinking wine. That fits into one of the themes of Masechet Avodah Zarah, which says wine of non-Jews, or wine that in fact has been touched by non-Jews, is forbidden for Jews to drink. Some in part of that, there's a fear that the wine was used for libations, for religious, right, idolatrous purposes. But the rabbis have made some comments also that drinking wine together with non-Jews leads to some social mixing, which isn't, which the rabbis, are, one of the themes of Masechet Avodah Zarah seems to be that we're trying to stay separate, and one of the ways to stay separate is not to drink together or share and drink. But here we have two rabbis drinking wine, and lo and behold, what happens? A certain man came, and they said, "Come, serve us drinks." The Gemara here is brief, like it often is when it's telling stories. A certain man comes by. We don't know very much about this person. We don't know if it's just a passerby where they say, "Hey, serve drinks to us," or buy us a drink, or we don't know if it's like the waiter in the establishment that they're drinking in, or the bartender or something like that. But someone comes by and they say, "Serve us drinks." And seems the person does. After he poured the wine into the cup, it was revealed that he was a Gentile. This becomes the problem that this story is raising. All right. A non-Jew comes and pours wine for these two rabbis while they're drinking at their request. When they asked for the wine to be poured, they were not aware that he was a non-Jew, but it turns out that he was. And the issue now becomes, the question on the table in the story is like, what do? They have these 2 cups of wine in front of them, poured by a non-Jew. Can they keep drinking it? And the story ends by telling us, oh, sorry, my touchpad is very sensitive today. One of these sages prohibited them from deriving benefit from the wine, and one of them permitted the wine even for drinking. So we don't know which said which, but these two are sitting together. They invite someone to pour wine for them, and that person does. They find out the person isn't Jewish. One takes the most permissive position that says not only can we derive benefit from the wine, we can also keep drinking it. And the other one says, oh no, not only can we not drink the wine, we can't even derive benefit from it. So they take the two polar opposite positions that they could. So here's a story that shows, right, it brings up the dilemma that we've seen a lot in this chapter, and maybe the whole Masechet about drinking wine with non-Jews or wine that comes in contact with non-Jews. Here, while the Masechet as a whole tends to forbid, tends to push away, here we see an early story in which these two rabbis come into contact with wine poured by a non-Jew, and they take two totally opposite positions about it. That's the story. The early conversation in the Gemara tries to understand these positions. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi comes and says, the one who prohibited the wine properly deems it prohibited, and the one who permitted it properly deemed it permitted. So now we have what I labeled before, an early piece of Gemara. We know this because it's a named rabbi who's quoted by name, giving an analysis of a prior text. That's the style of some early Gemara. And what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says is, actually, while these two people have an opposite opinion, both of them are legitimate, right? It rings true. We've seen stories about, right, both Hillel and Shammai, even though they're different, they're both speaking halachic truth, Jewish legal truth, or they're both interpreting the Torah in God's way. We see this here with not Hillel and Shammai, but two other rabbis, right? Yeshua ben Levi comes and says both of their positions are proper, even though they're opposite. And now Yeshua ben Levi, or perhaps the Gemara, editors of the Gemara, are going to explain what he means by this. So first, we're going to dig into the one who prohibited the wine. So the one who prohibited the wine holds that the Gentile says to himself. So the explanations that allow him to prohibit the wine are based on the narrative that's going on inside the head of the non-Jew who poured it. This is what one of these rabbis puts into the head of the wine pourer. Could it enter your mind that great sages like these are drinking liquor? Shichra is the Aramaic in the text. Rather, this is certainly wine they are drinking. What happens? The waiter or the passerby says, these two rabbis are fine gentlemen, and there's no way they're drinking lower quality liquor as opposed to higher quality wine. Must be wine that they are drinking. And because the person who's pouring assumes they're drinking wine, therefore this Gentile may be tempted to perform wine libations with the wine, and that would make it forbidden. Now, we don't know for sure that they saw the person doing it, but the text seems to hedge it. It doesn't tell the story about the person went and did wine libations. But since the pourer assumes that it's wine, that gives the opening to this person who may have gotten the wine, right, unsupervised by the rabbis, that the person may have used it as a libation, may have used it for idolatrous purposes. Because of that, it's proper, says Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, to prohibit it if this is what goes through the head of the person. The other opinion says the one who deemed the wine permitted also did it properly. And here's what that person thinks the Gentiles said to themselves. Could it enter your mind that great rabbis like these are drinking wine and they said to me, a Gentile, come serve us drinks? Rather, is certainly liquor that they are drinking. So here's the opposite assumption. Here the non-Jew comes by and says, oh, these two rabbis asked me to pour them a drink. They must know I'm a Gentile, and since they do, they would never have asked me to pour them a drink of wine because they wouldn't be allowed to drink it if they do, so it must be liquor that they're drinking. And as a result of that, the pourer of the wine wouldn't pour off some of the wine as a libation because it's not wine, it's liquor in his mind. And as a result, then this wine should be permitted. So, some things that are interesting here. One, the law in this situation depends on what you assume the waiter or the passerby thinks when they're pouring the wine. And each of the rabbis makes a different, I guess, some kind of cultural or socioeconomic comment. The first one thinks the non-Jew would assume that the rabbis are fancy and would only drink wine and not liquor, which was considered less of a quality drink. And if not, they're assuming that non-Jews would make the assumptions that rabbis are only drinking wine, and that means they could pour libations for it. The second opinion assumes that the non-Jew is aware of the laws of Masechet Avodah Zarah. It says these rabbis would never ask me to pour wine. Assumes that the person knows that they're rabbis, knows that they're not allowed to drink the wine if he pours it for them, and then assumes as a result it must be liquor even though it's not, which ends up making the wine safe. Each one makes some assumptions about what's in the mind of the person, and based on those assumptions, you can conclude, equally so, says Yeshua ben Levi, that either the wine is permitted or the wine is forbidden. So here we have this story and the early analysis that shows there are two different opinions in the Gemara about what to do in this scenario. One is lenient, one is strict. One permits them to drink the wine, one forbids. And at this stage in the conversation, the Gemara, both the story and the explanation are comfortable with both alternatives. Meaning, here we have a case where a non-Jew pours wine. If we were going to lean strictly, like my read is generally in the end, that's where the Gemara ends up. Let's be as strict as possible. This wine shouldn't be permitted. And yet there's another opinion that says maybe it could be permitted, which sometimes we know that's in the style of the Gemara. There are always exceptions to any rule. And something we've been exploring here is exceptions about the permissibility of wine that may or may not have come into the contact with the non-Jew based on that. But here with not so much detail, just based on the assumptions that the rabbis make about what this Gentile non-Jew is thinking, they rule in totally opposite directions, and the Gemara at this point seems comfortable with both of them, which I don't think is the same tone as the Gemara lands at later, which is the contrast I want to draw with the end of this conversation, which is coming next. So we're moving from early Gemara to late Gemara. The late Gemara here that we're going to see doesn't have named rabbis, has a lot of questions back and forth, and gets much more technical. That's a style of the later layers of the Gemara. And the Gemara is going to challenge this more permissive opinion by asking a series of questions about it. So the first question is, doesn't the Gentile see whether it's wine or not? Meaning, in this scenario, where with the second case, where the rabbi is, whichever one it was, permits the wine to be drunk on the assumption that the non-Jew who poured it thinks it's liquor. The Gemara says, this can't be. The non-Jew should know whether it's wine or liquor. You can tell the difference between wine or liquor. Why didn't the Gentile know which it was? But we should be able to, right, if then they would know it was wine, and it should be prohibited, like it should be clear. And the response to that says, well, the incident occurred at night. So it was at night, it was dark, it was harder to see what was in the glass or the bottle. So the pourer was not sure if it was wine or liquor, and that's why potentially we could permit it. Then question two, well, doesn't the Gentile smell it and recognize that it's wine? Okay, you told me that it was nighttime, and so the non-Jew can't see, but that's not the only senses we have. Why couldn't he smell it? Wine and liquor don't smell the same. You know, but any Gentile who's pouring drinks should be able to tell the difference by smell between wine and liquor. The Gemara says, well, the incident occurred with new wine whose smell does not diffuse. So I didn't check the wine scientists to know about, whether or not this is true. I'm taking the assumption of the Gemara to be true. And they're assuming that if it's newer wine, the smell doesn't spread out as fast as older wine. That could be true. I wonder if wine ages, it gets the smell diffuses quicker or not. But that's the rabbi's assumption. New wine, you can't smell as easily from a distance. So the Gentile might have, had it been older wine, aged wine, be able to tell by smell, but this must have been a case of new wine. Then to keep going, they said, but wait a minute, wouldn't the Gentile have touched the wine when they took it out of the pail and poured it into the glasses? So this is a case of a Gentile's unintentional touch, and therefore the wine should be prohibited. So now we get even more technical. All right, maybe the person didn't know if it was wine or liquor, but if they're taking some kind of ladle or cup or scoop to go into the pail or the barrel or something and scoop out the wine, they definitely touched it. And if they touch it, it should definitely be prohibited. So how could this be a case where anyone could permit it? And the Gemara says, getting a little more technical, you can tell by the longer answer. Well, no, this story was taught because we want to understand the law that the Gentile was pouring from one vessel to another vessel without touching the wine. Meaning they weren't sticking their hand with a cup or a ladle or something into a barrel to take out wine and put it in the glass. They were pouring from a bottle or some other, vessel, a jug, into the wine. And therefore, this is a case where the wine was poured by the force of the Gentile's action without any intention of offering it as a libation. Right? What did this Gentile do? They intended to pick up a bottle, which they thought was liquor, pour it into a cup. The wine pours by the tilting of the bottle. There was no intention of the Gentile to offer a libation here, or no opportunity for them to do so. They're just pouring from the bottle into the glass where the rabbis are drinking. And they're doing this in a way that doesn't allow them time or intention of offering a libation. And in such a case, the sages did not issue a decree prohibiting the wine, and it's permitted for someone to drink it. To notice what's happening here, right? This later layer of the Gemara limits the case so that the permissive position is far less applicable to situations that might occur, right? When you read the story initially, right? If we go back, let me just go back to the story. The story just said, what happened? A man came by and they said, pour us drinks. He poured it and they found out he was a Gentile. One of them says, you could still drink the wine. And one of them, right? They say, what should we do? This guy's not Jewish. He poured us wine. One says, yep, let's have it. And the other one says, no, can't drink it. We need new wine. None of these cases are here. These rabbis maybe on the spot make a decision. But what does it happen after we have this whole conversation? Well, the permissive position is reduced to not all times of day, but only at night. The permissive position is reduced from not all types of wine, only new wine. The permissive position is limited to times where the non-Jewish pourer of the wine is pouring from one vessel to another, not taking it out of some kind of bigger vessel where they have to put in a ladle or a cup or something where the wine might come into contact with their hand. And as a result of that, this original story and the original positions, which seem to say, there's a yes or a no here, winds up being much more weighted to the no side, and the yes side is much more limited than we started out from the beginning. Now, you could say from the end of the story, like some interpreters do, like, well, these questions at the end are actually describing details of the story that were left out, meaning you could say the intention of the early story all the time was to mean this happened at night with new wine when it was poured from one vessel to the other. Or, as I'm more likely to read this to say, the story was far less interested in the details and said, if a non-Jew comes and just picks up your bottle to pour it or not, there's a difference of opinion about whether you can drink the wine or not. And later, as the Gemara delved into the details or looked at it and said, wait a minute, and started to ask all these questions, the end result of the later Gemara is to land in a much more restrictive space than it started from the story originally, which is the influence, I think, of the later layers of the Gemara trying to restrict the access of people, of Jews, to their non-Jewish neighbors, in the pub or with this wine or in these situations. Right, that's the end of the text. I'm going to stop the share and come back to the screen. So I point this out to you because, in part, in my read of this Masechet is that generally it's trying to be restrictive. And the restrictive nature is trying to not just, restrictive one, because the prohibition against engaging in idolatry is it's strict in the Torah, and the rabbis continue that. But there's a sociological thing at work here too, which is the rabbis in trying to avoid idolatry are trying to provide distance between the Jewish community and their non-Jewish neighbors, in part, right, to prevent idolatry, and in part to keep the communities apart. But we see from this story, and not just this story, many of the cases that the rabbis are exploring in this Masechet, examples where rabbis aren't as strict as the overall tone of the Masechet as a whole. And what I've started to notice as I've read the Masechet is that it's a lot of the earlier layers that are a little more permissive, and the layers that get stricter. And it's one of the reasons why we land feeling stricter about this Masechet, because as the conversation ends, as we see the more restrictive positions that might be more characteristic of later periods, and that's where we end up. And I wonder, is our overall influence of the Masechet as a whole, based on the speed at which we're reading it, looking at the later layers, not the earlier layers. And I wonder if we might lean more on the earlier layers as opposed to the later ones, and thinking about separations between communities, as we apply these texts in other days and other eras. So we have a few minutes to go. I see the chat has been active, but once again, haven't been able to follow it. So Rachel, if you have things from the chat to call out, or we want people to raise their hands, have at it. Let's see what you're about to say.
Aaron, we'll start with your question and then I'll let folks raise their hands from there. We only have 5 minutes though. So Aaron's question is, what is going on in history that later rabbis are stricter?
Oh.
And I feel like that's not just a Talmud question, but a broad Jewish history question, potentially.
Potentially. Well, so one, I would say this one, I think, doesn't have to do with history. It has to do with the nature of texts, and the more you read them, that in the Beit Midrash, in the Talmud in particular, right, some of what the later conversations were taking earlier texts and asking more detailed questions about it. And the more you look at the text and what it says and dig down, there's a tendency when you go by the book to pull to the right, to be more conservative. Right? There's a great article about this, about the modern era, about people by one of the Soloveitchiks. I'm not going to remember it this early in the morning. Just about how, right, as it was a paper about people who become Baal Tshuva, right? People who grow up not religious, who become religious, who have more questions to ask. And then they ask their rabbis questions and they look it up in the book, and the book pulls you to more conservative, where, right, some of this article is about kashrut, where if you grew up keeping kosher, more likely you did what your parents or grandparents did. People in their own kitchens make all kinds of exceptions, but if you go to the book, it pulls you more conservative. And some of the pull to the right argued, I think it was Aaron Soloveitchik, call it a pull to the right in observance, especially about kashrut, was the fact that people were learning, became more dependent about what the rules in the manual said and not what their grandmothers did in their kitchen. And that was a pull in that direction. So that didn't have to do with history. It had to do with being text focused and analysis of text as opposed to history. Um, the historical, in the time of the Mishnah, it wasn't such an easy time under the Roman Empire in Eretz Israel. And some of the times in Babylonia under the Persians, when the Talmud was written, it was an easy time for Jews. So, like looking at the Talmudic history in particular, there aren't necessary trends one way or the other. You could look at particular periods, right? And there are texts from the time of the Mishnah in the Talmud, right, and quoted in the Gemara. Some that are very fearful of the enemies that say stay away, and some are very embracing, right? The rabbis sometimes speak out against Rome as the enemy, and sometimes look at Rome and all of its accomplishments and say this is a wonderful place. Sometimes the rabbis are in dialogue, put themselves in dialogue with Roman generals and rulers and shopkeepers, philosophers, and sometimes they don't. So I'm not sure it's necessarily a trend in one direction to the other. But I think, Aaron, that's a good question for us to. Oh, there we go. Chaim Soloveitchik, Rupture and Reconstruction. Chaim wrote that. Maybe Chaim Soloveitchik's on the call, quoted his own article, but I'm assuming it's a different Chaim. But that's the article people were asking. It was Rupture and Reconstruction. It's a great one to go watch and see. Aaron, I feel like this was a woefully brief and inadequate answer to your beautiful question that requires far more study than we have minutes right
now. All right. Well, we'll have to continue thinking about that yet further. But yes, that is one of the patterns we do see historically. I think there's also patterns of going the opposite direction. And they're sort of yin yang about it.
Right. I thought about quoting, with wine in particular, I know the conservative movement, which is where I'm a rabbi, like has a paper on the books that allows people to drink non-hechshered wine. Because the reason why wines aren't kosher is the fear of idolatry, not because of the fear of non-kosher products in the wine. And there are positions that say that the non-Jews we live with who make wine are not pagans. And so there's no reason for this prohibition anymore, and we should take it away, right? There's some senses of we shouldn't just keep prohibitions because they're on the books. Prohibitions that are there for a reason. If the reason goes away, we should move on to it and feel fine about it. There are those who hold that position and say many of the laws, especially about alcohol in this chapter, don't apply today, and we we should drop them because the reason why the rabbis had it don't apply. We live in a much different society, and there's no reason to ban non-hechsher. That's also a whole hour's conversation, but yeah.
I would like to briefly address Laura's question, and then Carol, did you have your hand up for a minute? You can put it back up. We'll grab you too, and then we'll wind down. So Laura says, basically, this was really helpful to be able to see the different historical layers. Can you give us like a quick primer on the historical layers in the Talmud and how a casual reader might begin to start to differentiate between those?
Um,
And
that's
with
a
the understanding that like this question has launched 1,000 dissertations, right?
yes,
But there are some clues in the text that a casual reader can glom onto to understand when they're reading a line which historical layer that line is from.
yes. So I'll give you some of the basic principles. It's harder to notice if you're reading a translation, but generally speaking, in the Talmud, the texts that are in Hebrew as opposed to Aramaic come from the era of the Mishnah. So even though they're not part of the Mishnah, if the language is Hebrew, they're usually Tannaitic texts, which puts them same timetable as the Mishnah. Um, the next layer are sort of short disputes between people like Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel says yes, Rav says no, or something, simple like that. The named longer Aramaic statements are usually next, and then the unnamed anonymous statements where the logic goes crazy is the word that's coming to mind, but not Talmudic. That maybe is a better word. Those tend to be the later layers. My friend and colleague Josh Culp wrote a book about how the editing of like how you could see the layers in the Talmud. Oh, I'm also not thinking about the name. Maybe we'll cross too. The first 40 pages of that book are like a good overview of all of this. Ooh, I think it's on my shelf right behind me, but we're running out of minutes. Hang on, I could Google it really fast. Maybe we'll see if I can Google it fast. But that I gave you the shortest possible answer I could give, and it's a good 40-minute read. Sorry, 40-page read. Josh Culp's books. Oh, look at that! I googled Josh Culp's books. It's called Reconstructing the Talmud. Josh Culp and Jason Rogoff. Reconstructing the Talmud. This book it's two academics, but they're writing for a non-academic audience. The introduction to this book, Reconstruction the Talmud, is the best way for you to get like a graduate level, but plain language explanation of like what scholars have taught us about the layers of the Talmud. And then the rest of the book gives examples. So it's great. It's a good read. It's well worth it.
I actually haven't read it, but it's actually on a long list of mine for things we might do in the Off the Duff book club. So if anyone
Wow.
here has read it and has a recommendation, thumbs up, thumbs down, whether that would be a good whether accessibility is really important there to me. So, but I just don't. I'm aware of the book, but have not cracked
Uh,
it. So, all right, let's grab Carol's question and then we'll let folks go.
all right.
Well, thank you, Dr. Scheineman and Rabbi Goldberg, for this interesting layered shiur, which I learned a lot from. And actually, just for the sake of time, I think my question, which was similar to Aaron's about why the rabbis became more stringent, has been answered. But I was wondering how the flow of life in the diaspora and assimilation either inspired the rabbis to be more stringent as they saw kind of mingling and mixing. Because last week in the discussion, someone mentioned that the rabbis in the later parts of Avodah Zarah are being more lenient or more relaxed. And I think the comment that you made about the yin and the yang helped me. So if there's not time, we don't have to go into it, but thank you.
Carol, that's a great question and observation. I think we've seen more narratives and lenient exceptions that's lean to the lenient. Like you're right, here's the prohibition, but here's some ways it doesn't apply. I've been noticing that more. I haven't tracked it to see, but I feel like in these later pages we've seen more of it. I think it's totally a fascinating thing. The last thing I would add that hasn't come up with, I wonder how much the separation was the rabbis just embracing what was imposed, meaning in some of the under some of the empires that the Jews lived, or in some of the countries that they lived, Jews were kept separate by the other society, and maybe it was empowering to say, "Oh no, we're doing this on purpose." It is a challenge that played out in certain ways, right, in the ancient world, in the rabbinic world, in the Middle Ages, and in modern times. And it's a question Jews have as a people. We're a very small minority of the world population. How much do we want to keep to ourselves? How much do we want to integrate? There are lots of different answers to that question, in the world today, and different subcommunities and do different things about how and when they integrate, both with work, with commerce, with with neighborhoods, with daily living, and there's no one right answer to that question. And what's going to be right for us in this era, we won't know till 200 years from, which is better for the survival of the Jewish people and keeping us intact. We won't know for 200 years until we can look back and see what happened now and which strategies worked for now. That's my take on Jewish history, right? That the diversity of the Jewish community gives us the flexibility to deal with whatever comes up in current times, so that someone is ready to respond to the challenges of that time. And it's usually that Judaism that moves on, while other ideologies that don't fit the era in which they live tend to die out. That's a longer conversation too, more in the realm of history, although the Talmud certainly has some examples of
that. All right. I'm going to throw one more recommendation into the chat here. Different Rabbi Chaim. This is Rabbi Chaim Ovadia, because this is back to the question of whether, whether the tradition always becomes stricter or then becomes less strict. This YouTube video, which only has 64 views, I'm one of them. Yeah, but I do recommend it. It is a lovely, lovely treatment of how to prepare for Passover. That, like Passover is like one of those areas where Jews can go to higher and higher levels of strictness really easily. And he really brings it back down to logical basics. And just, to my mind, is a voice of sanity in that discussion, and is an example of the opposite. Like, what do we really need to do to clean for Passover, as opposed to, who's got the next chumrah, the next most strict thing that I'm going to feel obligated to follow. So, and then he has some really great observations also at the end of the video on the book of Exodus and the interpretation of the Passover story. So that is just my own little recommendation to add to the reading list today. It looks like the Chaim Soloveitchik article has been popped into the comments a couple of times. Thank you to folks who directed us to that. Thank you, Rabbi Goldberg, for this teaching. Thank you to all of you for comments and participation. Always wonderful to learn with you. And we will be in your inbox tomorrow morning, and we will be here in 1 week's time again to learn more. Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everybody.